All right, aloha students. Today we're going to talk about the Cold War. I'm sort of a product of the Cold War. I grew up during the, sort of as the Cold War was pretty hot, but it also came to an end. So I think a lot about the Cold War and having to do with my own life. And so I find it very interesting. I didn't really think about it too much, but I will show you a way in which it did very much affect me personally. How's that sound? Okay, when I'll get to that in just a moment. All right, so the Cold War, this is a term you've heard. Maybe you recall back in world history class, we already sort of hit on this, didn't we, in world history class. Who recalls from world history class what we did having to do with the Cold War? Well, maybe you recall the ancient Greek Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which I sort of compared to the Cold War of the 20th century. Maybe you recall the vocabulary word microcosm. Hopefully you remember that. If you don't, I can send you a couple movies on how the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta was a microcosm of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. You hopefully wrote a big essay on that. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. That'd be great if you did. Okay. When does the Cold War start? Well, we're really talking about the nuclear age, or we're talking about when each side could hurl big rockets full of nuclear warheads on each other. And so we really sort of started right after the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. The United States dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So really, the point is that now all the big powers, really the victors of World War II, what are they going to be doing? They're going to be competing to make atomic bombs. And out of atomic bombs grow hydrogen bombs, and out of hydrogen bombs grow nuclear bombs. They get bigger and bigger. So that's where we sort of say it started. When does it end? Most historians agree it ends with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, when the Soviet Union sort of breaks apart. Nations like the Ukraine emerge from the old Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union ceases to be what was, of course, a communist state. All right. Now, this is maybe the main thing that you recall from. That essay about the Athenians and the Spartans, is the concept of cold. Why is it called a Cold War? Dare I even say, in between the Persian Wars and the start of the Peloponnesian War, Athens and Sparta had a Cold War where there was high tensions. How's that sound? And there's no specific battle fought. And this is exactly why we sort of say this about the Cold War of the 20th century, is that there's not a specific super documented incidents where American troops squared off against Soviet troops across some battlefield. There were hot spots of the Cold War where Americans were located on one side and probably Soviets were located on the other side. But do we have this specific battle where the thing escalates and the war becomes hot? No, we don't have that. And so basically this is a ideological war. How's that sound? That's one way to think about it. The ideologies of both sides want to spread around the world. And because both sides want to spread, each side wants to contain the other. So that's the one way I would sort of think about it. Each side wants to contain the other, contain the spread. So the U.S. feared the spread of communism. And so they did their foreign policy, the United States foreign policy for the Cold War, was to do whatever was possible to stop the spread of communism, whereas the Soviet Union feared the spread of democracy and capitalism. And so they would do whatever was in their power to prevent the spread of those two concepts, okay? And so each side sort of established a sphere of influence, where their sort of ideals dominated. And each side would be very careful to infringe or impinge upon the other side's sphere of influence. Okay, so what are these spheres of influence? Well, we really sort of break the world in half.
areas of the Earth where the other side was supposed to keep out. And look, one of these most highly contentious areas where the spheres rubbed up against each other was in Europe. And of course, as World War II comes to an end, you have the American Army is all the way in Germany. They're halfway across Europe. The United States Army is spread widely across Western Europe. And ultimately, of course, the Americans are going to pull out they're going to pull out a big number of forces out of Western Europe and send them home. The Americans do leave troops behind after World War II. Don't kid yourself. But really, that becomes the sphere of influence of the United States, is the Western Europe and the Western Hemisphere. Whereas the Soviet sphere, and this is sort of why we're going to do those maps here in a moment, the Soviet sphere is really Eastern Europe and Asia. All right. Now, there are areas like, the best example is Cuba. Cuba is obviously in the Western Hemisphere, and Cuba became a communist country. So it was a Soviet-influenced and some would argue controlled country in the Western Hemisphere. So there were examples where each side's sphere was touched upon by the other. Now, we mostly think about, when we think about the Cold War, we think about nuclear weapons. We think about the nuclear age. The splitting, the power of the atomic bomb is the splitting of the atom, and the power the energy that creates. Well, you can split the nucleus of an atom now, and that's basically what this is all about. And how would you get these things to the other side? Well, you wouldn't fly a plane over Hiroshima and drop a nuclear bomb. You would attach a nuclear warhead to the tip of a long-range missile, and you would fire it from a land-based or submarine-based launch pad at the enemy country. So this is different. This is the technology is getting better. So this is not just the improvement of weapons, it's the improvement of delivery systems. And yes, they did still use planes to drop these, but they're not just dropping bombs straight down anymore. They're dropping missiles from planes that could launch themselves and go a particular distance. Cruise missiles. Like I said, you launch rockets from your territory, from your nation to another nation. Okay, so what are some of the battlefields of the Cold War? Okay, so luckily no nuclear weapons were ever fired. What are some of the original battlefields of the Cold War? Well, probably the first one is the Korean Peninsula. The Korean War breaks out 6 years after World War II ends. You can make the argument that war is still ongoing, as there's never been a peace treaty between each nation. North Korea, of course, is very well known about in modern times about the harshness of that situation in that country. South Korea is a very advanced, modern, capitalistic, free market society. Probably the hottest spot of the early part of the Cold War was Berlin, Germany. I'm going to describe that to you in just a moment here. Berlin was the hotspot of the Cold War for much of it. For the longest time. We'll talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can talk about that. That was a short-lived hotspot, but Cuba certainly was a hotspot. But I would sort of say Berlin lasted longer. And part of it has to do with the wall, which I'll discuss it with you eventually. The Vietnam War was certainly a hotspot of the Cold War. That was exactly this whole concept of trying to contain the other side. The United States really went to Vietnam to contain the spread of communism in that country. As time went along, we sort of think about in our time we think about Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden and that whole business, but the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, so that is not necessarily, after 9/11 is not really the first time Afghanistan has been in American news. It was certainly a hotspot of the Cold War. The space race is absolutely an element of the Cold War, and the space race has to do with this idea of these long-range nuclear weapons, all right? we're building rockets to launch. How about I put it this way? Are we building rockets to take astronauts into space, or are we building rockets to deliver? Are we just doing that to improve our technology to use rockets to deliver weaponry? Okay, and you know the Olympics. We have a project that some of you got to do on the politics in the Olympics, and several of those Olympics of modern times, particularly the 1956 Summer Olympics, the 1980 Winter Olympics, the boycotts of Olympics in 1980 and 1984 certainly revolved around the Cold War. There's no disputing that. I would say the highest points of the Cold War, the two moments where it really sort of was very close to getting hot. The best example I would probably say is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I was sort of pointing this out a moment ago. This was a short-term event that was very scary, whereas the discussion about the Berlin, originally there was an airlift to bring supplies to West Berlin. We'll see that Berlin and Germany are both divided. That was in the 1950s, and to solve that problem, the communists built a wall in the city of Berlin. Again, I'll talk about that momentarily. So there's massive amounts of money spent on research and development of weapons, okay? And yes, the space race is you could make an argument, the space race is a beneficiary of this massive amount of money spent. There's also a massive amount of money spent on aiding enemies of the other side. So let me give you a couple of examples to sort of explain what I mean by this. And that is that the United States, as you all know, the United States sent troops to Southeast Asia twice in the second half of the 20th century, to Korea and to Vietnam. In both cases, and this is sort of what I meant a moment ago when I was talking about it doesn't really ever get hot, but the fact of the matter is that Soviet military advisors, Chinese military advisors, and in some cases troops, were in Korea, and they were in North Vietnam, and they were aiding the communist forces of those two nations against the United States. And you may say, those dirty rats. Well, look, we did the same thing. So when the United States, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the United States was right there financing Afghani rebels against the Soviet invasion. So elements of the United States military were in Afghanistan fighting, and look, in both cases, hey, American troops are killed by, you could argue, Soviet weapons at the very minimum. Soviet troops are killed by American weapons at the very least in Afghanistan. There was an eventual realization, and this is really sort of an underlying theme of the entire Cold War, that if a nuclear war ever started, it was going to destroy humanity. There became, both sides had so many weapons, they had so many rockets, they had so many warheads, that it became a suicide pact. And look, there were some who believed that one side or the other could, there were Americans who believed we could have won a nuclear war. There were certainly people in the Soviet Union that believed they could have won a nuclear war. But what comes out of it on the other side, even once the first one gets, the first rocket gets sent, and look, it's going to be all over. And there is a term for that, and I'll come back to that. I'll give you that term in just a moment. But this is really sort of an underlying theme. And part of it is like, okay, well, we know they have this, we know the Soviets have this many rockets in the ground. Well, we have to we have to use our nuclear warheads to knock out their rockets. They will shoot their rockets at us to knock out our rockets. All right, so it doesn't, yes, we're going to bomb your cities and those types of things, but we're going to take out your rockets. That's why we need so many. That's why there were so many built. Okay? Now, I would also say there is one fun part about the Cold War, and it is actually kind of fun, and maybe you're aware of this. I love acronyms. And the Cold War, if there is not one thing about the Cold War that you should know, it's the fact that the Cold War has more acronyms than any other point in history. and some of them are really good. And I'm not going to give you all of them, but I'll give you some of them. And you know, probably the easiest one is USSR. All right, so I think you know this one. Of course, we discussed Animal Farm and the story behind that, and we've discussed the Russian Revolution and Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky and all those guys. Okay, so you know this one. USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. All Americans knew what USSR stood for. All right, so now here's another one that most Americans all got to learn, ICBMs. What the heck is an ICBM? Remember, these still exist. I mean, an ICBM is one of these rockets, an intercontinental ballistic missile. All right, that's one of the all-time good ones right there. Okay, one of the all-time good ones right there. ICBM. All right, how about this one? MAD. This is a reference to the realization that a nuclear war was unwinnable. MAD stood for Mutually Assured Destruction. In other words, look, if one side starts it, that side's not going to win. Once one side starts it, both sides are going to be shooting. It's all over for the whole world. All right. How about this one? You know what you put? You know what you put on your ICBMs? You put MIRVs on them. MIRVs. So you attached MIRVs to your ICBMs. You know what MIRVs were? Multiple independent reentry vehicles. In other words, you could shoot one rocket at the other side. The Americans the Soviets didn't have as good of a system. The Americans had a very good system. So you would shoot one rocket and you could maybe put 24 nuclear warheads, in other words, miniature rockets, in the nose cone of the ICBM. And so as the ICBM came back towards the Earth, the nose cone would pop off, and you would have 24 multiple independent reentry vehicles hitting 24 different targets in the Soviet Union. That was the theory behind how that works. By the way, you know, you should keep in mind now, these missiles, you know, they go into space and then come back from space back into Earth's atmosphere before they hit their target. So that's how those things work. How about this one? SALT. So there were always discussions about treaties and peace treaties between the two sides, and these were called SALT talks. Strategic Arms Limitations Talks. All right. Here's one you already know. NATO. Okay, NATO, and we're going to do a map here in a second, and we'll get into this. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was the treaty organization that the United States was a part of, and the Western Europeans. Canada was in it. Okay. All right. Now here I mentioned to you at the beginning of this discussion that the Cold War. I'm a product of the Cold War. I'm a Cold War kid, I guess you could say. And I grew up in my formative years were the 1980s, as the Cold War was very hot. But at the same time, you know, the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets was in 1979. And, you know, the Cold War was getting hot in the 1980s. And then it's like this 1991 hits, and it seems like suddenly it's over. The Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and it's over. Well, one of the reasons why it was such a big deal to me is that it has to do with this acronym, NORAD. Okay? NORAD. You know what NORAD stands for? NORAD stands for North American Aerospace Defense Command Center. Okay? Now, you know what this thing is? It's a command center, but it was dug out of a mountain. In other words, the United States went inside of it in essence dug a humongous cavern inside of a mountain to set up a command center to view things, all of the American satellite images from space. And so the NORAD could detect if the Soviets launched some sort of attack. And the command center was, okay, suddenly these weapons are flying. Okay, we can lock up the command center because it's inside a mountain, and the mountain will protect the command center from the destructiveness of the missiles. The mountain where they dug this into is inside of a mountain called Cheyenne Mountain. all right? And Cheyenne Mountain is located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. All right, now, why does this have to do with Mr. O'Brien? Okay, guess the name of Mr. O'Brien's high school. Guess the name of the high school Mr. O'Brien went to. You guessed it, he went to Cheyenne Mountain High School. So I literally grew up right on the side of NORAD. In fact, I have toured NORAD twice. I have the opportunity to tour NORAD twice. So let me just show you this crude drawing I made one time to sort of make you understand what you're sort of looking at. So basically here's a mountain, right? And this is kind of actually what Cheyenne Mountain looks like, all right? And so what they did is they dug a tunnel in almost a mile deep into the mountain, and then they blew out the interior of the mountain like this, and then they built buildings in there. And then to the top is an attachment, and you can get satellite images in there and see how the point is that the mountain protects it. Okay? So the idea is if a nuclear, now these atomic weapons and these hydrogen weapons and these nuclear weapons, they don't blow up once they hit the target, they blow up above a target. All right, that's the idea behind it. So the idea is, what does the mountain do? The mountain protects from the reverberations, if you will, of the explosion of the bomb. Now, one of the things I would say here is, notice what I've again crudely drawn this. One of the things that happened was, the coolest thing of the tour was we toured one building, and well, one of the things that's cool is the gate. So let me get to the gate here, the door in just a moment. So we toured one building and we walked out of it, and there's a little bit of light here. You don't see the top of the opening really. So we walked down stairways, and we're going to walk up the next stairways, and our tour guide said, hey, look underneath the building. And you can see that I've drawn, these are not backwards number 3s. You can see that these are actually springs. Now this is not a picture I took, but all of these buildings inside of NORAD are built on springs. And now these coils are super thick. And so again, the idea is, yes, if the bomb hits and the reverberation comes, the problem is that these buildings are just built on the ground. They could topple, or they could topple into each other. When they're built on springs like this, what will the building do? Well, it'll shake for a little bit, but then what will it eventually do? It'll come to eventually get calm again. Okay, so I thought that was like super cool, and you kind of see this over here, get the idea. So the blast door, they have one of these super big blast doors. They actually have 2 of them at the end of the, really at the end of the tunnel with the 2-lane road that goes in and out of NORAD. And so that is thing, and I can tell you that's super cool. When you see that door, it's really super cool as well. Okay, so let's sort of finish this discussion up here. What is the importance of the Cold War? I'm on the downhill slope here. NORAD, by the way, NORAD is sort of closed down a little bit now because those types of things are not, this type of warfare is not as threatening, but it can be, my understanding is it can be reopened at a moment's notice. Look, there's trillions of dollars spent in the Cold War, trillions, to accomplish things that some would argue, looking back, was it worth it? Well, I think that argument can be made either way. It's an excellent debate. Certainly, there is no doubting that the computer age we live in today, I think this is a legitimate point that can be made. We think of the computer-based reality of today. That is definitely a product of the Cold War, because the trillions of dollars spent just really pushed technology to new levels and new heights. So if you love your computer, if you love the computer that is your cell phone, there's an element that you have the Cold War to thank for that, because that's where we really see massive developments. Okay, how does the Cold War end? Really, all historians are to the point that they agree that the Cold War was won by American President Ronald Reagan. And one of the things that he did, and there's a movie on him as well that you can check out, a movie of mine on him as well, is he basically said, instead of just sort of living with the Soviets, we're going to defeat the Soviets. But we're not going to defeat them on a field of battle. We're not going to launch missiles at them. We are going to defeat them in an economic battle. And he argued that the United States could easily outproduce the Soviet Union in any way, shape, or form, any time. that the capitalist free market system of the West, of the United States, could outdo a communist system anytime. And really what happened was, that's what he did. He said, try to keep up with us, and the Soviet Union could not. And one of the things that was part of what his economic plan was to build up a strong U.S. military. And one of the things that really scared the Soviet Union more than anything else was something that became known as Star Wars. Now obviously this is the movie, and this concept was basically called Star Wars because of the Star Wars movies. It was basically a satellite defense system, and I just mentioned a moment ago that these missiles are shot into space, and then they re-enter the atmosphere from space before they land on their target in whatever country. So basically what Star Wars was something called SDI. Here's another acronym for you. SDI stood for Strategic Defense Initiative. And the idea was that the United States was going to put a bunch of satellites up above the North Pole, because I don't know if you realize this, the closest line between the two nations is over the North Pole. So American satellites are going to sit up there over the North Pole, and whenever a Soviet missile came up there, these satellites were going to blow it out of the sky. And actually, I should probably say, blow it out of space. Now, there was a lot of discussion about, is that technology possible? Did we ever really believe? Would we really ever be able to do such a thing? Certainly, we can put satellites in synchronous orbit above targets, above places in the world. That's not a big deal. But could you actually blow a missile out of space as it came in? Well, the fact of the matter is the Soviets believed. They were afraid of it. They tried to develop their own system. Their economy really crashed, and that's sort of what led to the collapse of the Soviet economy. Okay, so let me just, we sort of associate, here's just some pictures for you to see. We sort of associate the Cold War with the various American presidents and Soviet leaders. So there's Kennedy, all right, and look, they met in many cases. The American leadership met with Soviet leadership. So we really associate it with sort of three sets of men. This is the first one. This is Nikita Khrushchev. He took over after Joseph Stalin. This is one of the face-to-face meetings they had. Okay, so here's the American President Nixon, and this guy's name was Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev was always noted because he almost had a unibrow. He had very thick eyebrows. And then probably the most famous pairing were these two guys. And this is President Reagan, and then this is Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev is always known because he has this sort of what is really ultimately a birthmark on his forehead. Okay, but let me show you a very interesting picture from that involves Reagan, and I'll sort of leave you with this. Reagan visited Moscow on a couple of occasions, and this is one of the occasions. And he's walking around Moscow, and there's Gorbachev right there. Okay, and so supposedly what happened was that this Soviet family that was on vacation saw Reagan walking around, and they came up and said hi to him. Well, the American Secret Service was very uptight about this because they didn't believe that this Soviet family was some real family. Even this kid was actually working for the Soviet KGB. Now, if you look very carefully, here's Reagan, okay? Check out this Soviet guy right here, all right? Now, what most people agree is that this was a KGB agent just sent to mess with Reagan. Now, if you look very carefully at this guy, who does this guy look like? Well, you might recognize him as the present leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Okay, we know Vladimir Putin was a KGB agent before the fall of the Soviet Union. And so many people say, yep, that was young Vladimir Putin as a practicing KGB agent. Now, Putin has denied that this is him. He says, no, that wasn't me. Okay? But it's a very fascinating picture. All right, so there's your story of the Cold War. We'll do some maps here in a moment. Hope you enjoyed the story.